Hey Tekoa friends, we are so excited you're joining us for a special Inauguration Wednesday Tekoa Talk. Austin and I are here to just share some of the conversations we've been having today about why today matters, why it's historic, and just sharing our hearts with you guys about how to move forward in this new season, in this new presidency.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a super important day. In other ways it's just another day happened and went by. But I think part of this our conversation even started just around the fact that this last year there's been so many divisions in politics and so many challenges and so many people not being heard, so many people that are trying to be heard, so many people shouting, other people that have just given up and walked away. And I think in some ways it's just been a mess. And it can be hard to either just be like against everybody or feel like it's not even worth it to engage anymore. I'm just going to walk away.
Yeah, the dumpster fire of 2020.
Yes. And I think today some people are so excited and other people are very disappointed. Other people are ambivalent, and in some ways it's, this is life. This is our country, and, we have a new president now. We have a new vice president now, and life is moving forward, and how do we respond? And I think we've been talking a lot about how important it is in how we respond and what we say, especially our words, especially online. I think if you're like me, so much of your newsfeed has people one way or the other that are upset or happy or both, about depending on who they're talking about and what they're posting about. But so many people that are just so vocal in a way that is not really helping the conversation. And I think we've been even talking about, as Christians, what is our response in politics? What is our response to other people? And I think we've been having the conversation focused around Jesus saying you need to love your enemies. And what does that mean? What does that mean with how we respond? And it's not that we don't engage, because I think it is important to engage, and it's not that even as Christians we shouldn't be vocal about trying to make a change even in politics. I think unfortunately the church has done a good job sometimes and a bad job sometimes, but you look at both sides of it. But at the forefront of moving towards abolishing slavery and other things were Christians. We look at Martin Luther King Jr. Day, he was a very vocal pastor that helped bring about change in our country for good. And there was a political activism part of that mattered. And we should do that at times, but we also need to be careful about how we're doing it and how we're saying, how we're portraying. And I think, especially today, if you're happy, how are you, yes, celebrate, but how do you do that in a way that is loving to those people that weren't as excited about what happened today?
Right. Well, I think for starters, celebrating today with grace and not just, jumping in and being politically driven, if you will. But I think also too, talking about how this year has impacted and shaped our future. And there's been so much that has been brought up, and how do we handle that, and how do we as Christians love those that are around us? And I think, Jesus said, love God, but love your neighbor. And the neighbor didn't have a quantifier of your neighbor needs to look like X, Y, and Z. It just said love your neighbor.
Well, I think he went even further. He said love your enemies. And I think that's something that we often miss of, we'll try to love our neighbor, but how many of us really love our enemies?
Right. Well, and I think that just because somebody believes differently doesn't mean they're your enemy.
Yes.
And I think that that's really something that is worth looking at, because just because somebody's Democratic doesn't mean they're the enemy of a Republican, or vice versa.
Yes. Or believes in everything that has happened within that party.
Right.
Or, doesn't mean all Republicans support what happened, at the Capitol, or, so many things that we just assume okay, you go in that camp because you're not in my camp.
Right. And I think one of the things that I've really been impacted by on this year is looking at how do you have those uncomfortable conversations with people, and how do you unpack that? Why do you feel the way you feel? Why are you gloating and celebrating? Or why are you throwing a toddler temper tantrum because it's not the way you wanted it? Why are you on either side? And what are your feelings behind that? Your values behind that? Your drive behind that? And I think that's such a frustrating thing with our social media world that we live in, is you're not going to get to that heart on social media. By throwing slander in the air, you're not loving your neighbor, and you're also not getting to know your neighbor. You are just throwing your opinions and your thoughts on somebody versus sitting down and going, hey, you said this. What are your thoughts behind that? Why did you say that? Or, looking at the heart of why somebody is celebrating today. Like, why is today such a special day? Why does today matter? And for some, it is a mourning and a sadness because the person you voted for didn't win. And then for others, there is a celebration of the person you voted for did win. But there's also so much more than that. And I think, like today we got to have that conversation about why does today matter for women? And like, what is the big deal about that?
Yeah, and for me, it doesn't connect as much because I'm not a woman.
Right. And I think like, just stop for a moment and think about like your daughter. There is now a woman in the White House that she can look to and be like, hey, I can do that. Whereas before, it was a whole bunch of men that she was looking at, and yes, she could still aspire to it, but there hasn't been somebody that's gone before her that's done it to show her these are the steps you can take to get here if that's where you feel called, if that's your purpose in life.
Well, and it just got easier
Yeah.
because somebody else had done it before. And I think you made the point that didn't even connect with me of like, well, who cares that much about the vice president unless something happens to the president?
Right.
Just not that important. It is, not to diminish, they do, especially foreign relations and other things. Like, there's importance, but to me it was like, okay, there's a woman as the vice president. It is what it is. It doesn't affect me that much. But you even made the point of, well, that's been established. Now to take the next step to become president, who knows how long that might be. It might be next election, it might be way down the road, but that first step has been taken, and so it's an easier journey for them as well. And so then for you as a woman, it feels like, okay, there's somebody at the top in our country, not just another country,
Right.
that I can kind of look up to say, hey, that's possible.
Right.
Not that you want to run for president, but
You never know. Hey, I'm still young. God might call me to politics. But I think that there is such a hope that is given to people that has been lost. That as women, there is a fight that has been going on. I mean, since 1920 when we finally got the right to vote, and like the steps that have been taken, and it's amazing to see the progress of America. And granted, she wasn't the main name on the ballot, but she was there, and people had a choice of, am I going to vote for a woman or not? And I think it's amazing to see that as a country we've recognized that women do deserve a seat at the table. There is an opinion and a voice that needs to be heard and matters. And I think it's such a powerful moment as a woman to be able to look to her and see, even if that isn't my desire. Like right now I don't desire to be vice president of the United States, but there is the potential. There is that hope, and I think that hope has been restored, and that's a beautiful thing.
Well, I think that's one of the things I love about us bringing you on the staff as a church. We're having this conversation together every week and talking of, hey, there's a different perspective. Hey, there is a seat at the table for women. There's a chance for you to show women, like, this is what it looks like to do ministry. This is what it looks like to be a pastor. This is, there's not like something that's out of reach for you. And the perspective is so different.
Yeah. And I want to go back to, I think the loving your neighbor, like that even ties into that. Like if you don't feel like a woman should be at the table, like spend time getting to know them, because we may not agree on everything, and we don't agree on everything, and that's okay. Like it doesn't say love your neighbor and agree on every single thing and you will have the same thoughts and visions and purpose for your life. No, it just says love them, and same with loving your enemies. Like it's a getting to know them and a deeper relationship that can happen. And so if you're feeling that turmoil and that unrest and uneasiness, like take the time to look into that and be like, why am I feeling this way? Have conversations with people, reach out, because I think when you reach out to people in love and you come from a place of love and of grace, of understanding, like, hey, I don't fully agree, but I want to understand. Can you share your perspective? Or what was your experience? Like even when we were talking about a woman being president, like you weren't coming at like, oh my gosh, a woman is vice president. But it was like, I just don't understand. Like, help me understand. And I think that is such a beautiful thing, that like, when we are meant to love our neighbors, that isn't a romantic kind of love, that is an understanding and a welcoming and an embracing of people.
Yeah. And I think it's where being a Christian, like really like the rubber meets the road often of, if we're really following Jesus, do we really follow those, or do we really love those, that it's hard to love. Like,
right.
Do we love the enemy? Do we love the person with a different opinion? And how do I support and uplift and not just for selfish ends? I think the Bible and God calls us to pray for those that are in government and support them. And like, that doesn't mean you just pray that they like get removed from office like tomorrow. Like that's not what it's saying.
Or pray that their their ideals and their morals are going to change to align to yours for selfish motives.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you really believe in what you care about and feel like, hey, this is what God wants, like this person's marginalized and I want to support them, or I want to like care for these people, like yes, God cares about those things, and those are good things for us to pray for, that our government would change or enact policies or do whatever. But at the same time, how do we support our government and really want the best for our country and trust that God's going to take care of it? Because I think that's the other piece of it, is trusting that God is going to take care of my life. He's going to take care of our country. Even if whether things get better or worse, do we trust that, well, God's got my life under control and it's okay, because the person in the White House has a lot and nothing to do with your life in some senses.
Well, and I think, like, we kind of had this conversation earlier, but I'd love to unpack it a little more about the idea that God's in control and God has the ultimate authority and power, and he knew that today was going to happen. He knew before the days were even begun that today was going to happen. And yes, we have a personal choice in it, and yes, there was a vote that happened and all of that, but God also knew what the outcome was going to be.
Yes.
And he's been a part of that, and he's going to continue to be a part of it. And I think whether you agree or disagree, I think, there's hope also in the scripture that talks about God will make all things good in his time. And I think it's that in his time part that sometimes is a little hard for us, because there is a waiting. And so I think this goes back to the idea about how do you love people with grace in this season. If you did, vote for the person that came into office and you are graciously winning versus, boasting and, being prideful, and like the reality is you didn't ultimately, like, you played a part in it, but you weren't the one that like put them there. And so it's hard sometimes to be a gracious winner, but also to not be a sore loser and be like, well, they're not my president, they're not my leader, because like you said, the Bible calls us to pray for our government and pray for our leaders, whether we agree with them or not, or whether we voted for them or not. We are meant to support them. We are meant to come alongside them and be like, hey, for at least the next 4 years, Joe Biden is going to be my president. Like, that's just the reality. Whether you agree or disagree, like, that is a fact. Like, that's not changing. I mean, unless, heaven forbid, something happens.
Crazy things can happen, but...
I mean, we just came out of 2020. Anything is possible. But I think that there is a call to be humble in that and to submit to that leadership and to recognize that there is prayer that can happen, but there's also grace that can come in this season, and that we are meant to graciously love those around us and graciously win and graciously lose. And that's hard, but that's a good thing in this season.
I think for even locally, I think even going back to the challenges we faced and just trying to understand with people from different viewpoints this last summer, with just some of the racial tension and issues that, haven't gone away. Talked about a little bit more with, Martin Luther King Jr. Day this week, but in some senses, like, the conversation has died down for some, and for other people, it's, it's their lives, and so it's
right.
It's just as important. But I think so many of us, like, feel like winners or losers in it, but how are we responding in love? How are we responding in grace? How are we trying to really care about those in our city, in our community, and around us, and not just, think it's my camp or your camp?
Right. This isn't a black and white, your win, my win, but this is our nation. And I think, today Joe Biden even talked about unity and how we can be a unified nation, and it is one nation under God. And I think it's really cool to think about that idea of, like, God created us all for a purpose. He created us in his image. And again, there was no quantifiers on only certain people or only certain nationalities or only certain genders, but it was all people. And so I think when we look at everybody through that lens of how God made us, that there is a different perspective that can be brought to, like, truly loving people who they are, because God created them for this time, for this season, for a purpose. And we are not meant to be the judge and ruler over everybody, because we don't have that authority. He does. And I think there's a freedom in that, of a release of, okay, there's a wisdom to be had. Don't misquote me on this. Like, there's a wisdom to be had in it, but there is also a freedom of, like, we are not meant to, like, figure out all the world problems and understand everything, but we are meant to love everybody around us, no matter what they look like, who they are, because they are created in God's image.
I think those are two good things to kind of even end the conversation today around the idea that we all were created for a purpose. And I think, you know, as a church, that's something we care deeply about, is helping people both discover that and then equipping them to live out that purpose. And I think even around these conversations, it's important to know, what has God made you to do? Who has he called you to be? And what is your role supposed to be? Because some of us are called to be in government, some of us are called to be politically active, some of us aren't. But in all things, like, what is your role? What is your purpose? What are you doing here? And, you know, if you care about issues, are you making a difference in your local, like, city to those around you? Who are you actually showing love to? Who are you making a difference in their lives? And are you living out who God created you to be?
Right.
And so I think that's, you know, a great question for us all to think about. Are we living that out? You know, and both sides of it. Some of us maybe are sitting back too much. We're like, I don't care about anything that happened today, this whole conversation. Maybe you didn't listen to it and get to the end because you don't care about it. But if you did get to the end of it, this conversation of, you know, what is your role supposed to be? Are you supposed to take a more active role, you know, locally or nationally or whatever it is? And then that second piece of it, how are you loving those around you? Because that's something we can all do better. You know, whether it be my neighbor next door, whether it be my friends, whether it be the person that's has a totally opposite viewpoint of me, but how are you actually seeking to love and care about those around you?
Yeah, and I think too, going into life with the mindset that, like, God puts people in your life and in your way for a purpose. And so when you are living that purpose out, there might be somebody that crosses your path at work or in your family or at the grocery store because of the neighborhood you live in. And there is a action that we are supposed to be taking of response, and that we are meant to be active, not passive, that we are meant to say hello to people and start conversations when we feel prompted. And that isn't all the time, but sometimes it is, and you never know who you're coming in contact with. You never know what season of life they are in. And so I think coming from that perspective, like we were talking about, of love and grace and understanding, that the world would be a different place. And I think that there's some beauty in having relationships with people that look different, and having relationships with people that believe different, that politically are different, that were brought up differently. All of those things, I think, when we all come together and are the body of Christ, that there is so much more fruit that can come of it. And so I think it's just a really good time for us to think about, like, how are we interacting with the people around us, and how are we living out our purpose within that? And are we leaning into it, or are we leaning back?
Definitely. Well, with that, I think just leave that challenge with all of you to consider, who around you can you show love to, can you show grace to today and this week especially. Who can you, I want to ask, like, who can you show love to that definitely is somebody that doesn't agree with you, somebody that is different than your perspective. And that's what we're supposed to do as Christians. We're supposed to love and care for those around. So we're glad you joined us today for this impromptu conversation that we got to have. Hopefully it was life-giving to you as well. We'll be back on Thursday for our usual Thursday Tekoa Talks, and we hope you'll join us then.